This last plenary of the day is entitled Some for All and New Mobility, Safety and Access Challenges. And I'd like to begin by taking us back to what we heard at the close of Dan Sperling's remarks this morning. So if you remember, he made those top recommendations at the end of his presentation, and the last of his recommendations was that equity of access needs to be a key priority in all policies and investments. And, you know, working in this sector, it is sometimes tempting to forget that it's not about mobility simply for its own sake, but about mobility for the sake of access. And that means access to employment opportunities and leisure options, access to healthcare and other social services. That alone is a big aim, but now add the other pillars of the Sustainable Mobility for All initiative. That means not only access, but safety, closely linked to access, of course, because transport that is unsafe is neither equitable nor inclusive. So is it utopian to expect policymakers and planners to triangulate the goals of safety and access as well as economic efficiency and environmental sustainability? That, in essence, is the question that we're going to be addressing both in this session and in the first plenary tomorrow morning. In this session, we'll explore those access and safety challenges, and tomorrow morning, we're going to take a deeper dive on the Sum for All pillars of green and efficient. And as always, at this year's TT, we are going to be keeping new technologies and new business models in focus as we do so, exploring how innovative approaches and solutions can facilitate access to opportunities, in particular for women and the poor, and how they can help countries and cities deliver on long-standing international commitments for greater safety in transport, commitments that often have not been met. So we're going to weigh possible trade-offs between access and safety and talk about how they can be addressed. And we are going to do so with an excellent group of international policymakers, national, local, and international, as well as analysts. So it's my pleasure to ask all the participants in Plenary 3 to please now join me on the stage, and you'll see your name tags up. Oh, well, you won't, will you? Okay. So we're going to be seated in alphabetical order, and I'll let you know when you're up here where your places are. If you'll please join me now. Sorry for the complicated logistics there, ladies and gentlemen, but we're now ready to begin. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our panel. I'm going to go alphabetically again from left to right, starting with Sergio Aveleda. He is Director of Urban Mobility at the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. And he was previously Secretary of Mobility and Transport in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where he was responsible for the most extensive bus system in the world. And he also spearheaded city implementation of the Vision Zero programs to reduce traffic fatalities, as well as overseeing taxi regulation, transport, mobile apps, and freight transport. So great to have you on the panel, Sergio. And seated next to him is Matthew Baldwin. He's Deputy Director, General Director for Transport and Mobility at the EU Commission, with responsibility for all transport modes, land, waterborne, and aviation, as well as multimodality. And in 2018, he was appointed European Coordinator for Road Safety and related aspects of sustainable mobility. And those issues are now his main focus. So it's a pleasure to see you again, Matthew. Great that you could join us. Next to him is Mary Krass. Wonderful to have you on this panel, Mary. She is Head of Institutional Relations and Summit for the International Transport Forum at the OECD, and she's also in charge of the ITF's work on accessible transport and social inclusion, sustainable urban mobility, and crime and terrorism issues. And she served as Sherpa to the former ITF Secretary General on the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory group on sustainable urban transport. So wonderful to have you with us. Next to Mary is Guillermo Dietrich. He's Minister of the Interior and Transport for Argentina. He was previously Buenos Aires Head of Transport and Transit, and in that capacity he developed the Metrobus system and an extensive network of cycling lanes and pedestrian lines. And he began his career heading up a family-owned automotive retailer, Dietrich Company, and also served as member of the board of directors of the think tank Fundación Ponsar. So great that you are here with us today. José Mendes is Portugal's Secretary of State for Mobility and Vice Minister for Environment and Energy Transition, in charge of the National Electric Mobility Program and of reforming the mobility regulatory framework. He also chairs the Transport Decarbonization Alliance, a global partnership of front-runner countries, cities, and companies. Next to him is seated Michael Replogle. He is Deputy Commissioner for Policy at the New York City Department of Transportation, focusing amongst other issues on traffic safety and management, shared mobility, autonomous vehicles, and regional and federal strategy. And he co-founded and chaired the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy and the Slokat Foundation. So great to see you again. And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome Anna Wellenstein. She is the World Bank's Director of Strategy and Operations in the Social, Urban, Rural, and Resilience Global Practice. She's setting strategy for analytics and financing in areas including urban development and geospatial technology. She has over 20 years of experience leading efforts to finance investments and build capacity to reduce poverty and boost equity. So we're going to begin this panel with an overview. We've asked Matthew Baldwin to get us started with a quick, and quick means 7 minutes, and I have to be strict because we're an enormous panel, and I really do want to get time to have some interaction. So an input on how new innovations are impacting road safety best practice in Europe. And after that, we're going to hear from Mary Krass, and she will give an equally short input on ITF findings regarding the opportunities and challenges of applying new mobility to improve access in urban areas, especially for the disabled. So I'm just going to ask Mary to go right after Matthew. I won't intervene again. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Melinda. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be in Washington, and this conference throbs with interesting issues. Mobility for all, as you put it, Melinda, so well. Well, it's enshrined in the EU treaty. Sustainable mobility has become a watchword in Europe. But 25,000 people a year die in the EU in pursuit of that right. And remember, 25,000 is quite a success story. That number has declined by more than half in this century, and it now represents no more than a tiny fraction of the more than 1.3 million global road deaths a year. As you mentioned, Melinda, I've been appointed as European Coordinator for Road Safety and Sustainable Mobility in October to help try to tackle this mobility conundrum, how we can really enable, facilitate mobility in all its forms with all the benefits that we know it can bring, as you've mentioned, but without the cost in terms of this hideous toll in terms of death and serious injury. So that's the angle I'd like to come at in these few moments. In fact, it's worth recalling that the broader external cost of transport, as currently configured, are very, very high in terms of environmental damage, in terms of road congestion and crashes. And if you're interested, we've just done a recalculation of those costs in the European Union at roughly 1 trillion euros a year, or around 7% of the EU's GDP. Some of that, of course, is recouped through taxes and charges, but guess what? Particularly in a city context, with growing urbanization, 2 billion more living in cities by 2045, we risk choking off the very benefits that flow from mobility. So we very much agree with the goals of the World Bank Sustainable Mobility for All initiative, precisely to deliver more equitable, efficient, safe, and green mobility. So what is Europe doing on safety? Well, first of all, I think we need to recognize that because of these kind of numbers, this need be no longer some sort of cool pipe dream, a marginal thing. It's got to be the core business of government, an economic and a political necessity we have to tackle. And we need joined up plans to address the issue at all levels of government and society because, if you will, the right policies hang together. Just take one example, sensible planning for limiting car use in cities, particularly internal combustion engine cars, can address at a stroke all three big areas of externality: safety, environmental damage, and of course congestion. On the safety side, if I may, three big challenges that I hope we can successfully focus on in the coming years. Firstly, the decline in our road death rate has slowed. Deaths are actually going up again in some European cities, and that's happening here in North America and elsewhere. Second, we've succeeded in making traveling in a car much safer, and that's great. But especially in cities, vulnerable road users are paying the price for their mobility. 40% of deaths occur in urban areas, and vulnerable road users now represent 80% of those urban casualties. A terrible irony here, which I'm sure all of you will appreciate. Just as we implement policies across the world to step up active mobility, walking and cycling, with all the health and the livability of cities that brings, we risk sending the message that you'd better retreat to your car because other methods of getting around just aren't safe. That is not tenable. And the third conundrum is that we don't yet know precisely just how connected and automated mobility and all the other forms of new mobility is going to contribute to road safety specifically, or indeed what they're going to contribute to what I call the whole mobility conundrum more generally. On road safety in Europe, despite the fact that we are going to miss our 50% reduction target for the decade finishing in 2020, we are revamping our road safety strategy. We're very proud of it. We're pushing ahead with new targets, and we'll need to, frankly, if we're going to get to zero deaths by 2050. It's the same across the UN system, by the way, and I very much hope at the Stockholm conference in 2020 that we can agree to renew UN global road safety targets for the next decade and keep them within renewed SDGs for road safety. They could expire next year if we're not careful. I'm very pleased that all 28 transport ministers of the European Union have agreed again to go for ambitious targets and, interestingly, to include a 50% reduction in serious injuries for the first time. We want, in a nutshell, at the EU level, to implement the safe system approach, not blaming humans for being human, but ensuring that they don't die from their mistakes, because death need not be the price that we pay for our mobility. Developing a system with all the elements in place, safe cars, safe infrastructure. On just those two items, we've new legislation on the table. We very much hope to see ambitious outcomes to that before the European Parliament comes to the end of its term in May. But also slower speeds, better use of protective equipment, and of course, better post-crash care. But we in the Commission want to work in a new and very different interactive way with member states. We don't need to be legislating everything to be effective. Let's just take speed as one great example. We know how important speed is as a factor both in causing accidents and rendering them more severe. I hear more and more from everyone who lives in cities just how much excessive speed is ruining the quality of life in cities. In the EU, we're trying to tackle speed in lots of different ways. First, as part of our safer car package I mentioned a moment ago, which would require all new car models from 2022 to have, for example, intelligent speed adaptation devices to warn the driver, thank you, to warn the driver that they're exceeding the posted speed limit. At the other end of the spectrum, we're encouraging and working with cities who want to introduce 20 mile per hour or 30 kilometre per hour speed limits. Crucial if we're going to reduce the number of vulnerable road user deaths, because the data is so clear on what happens in terms of crash severity above 30 kilometers per hour. And working with our member states to ensure that their national road safety strategies are strong in terms of speed enforcement, which again links back into the idea of developing agreed key performance indicators with member states, including on speed, where I think initially we'll be trying to gather data on how well the different speed limits across Europe are observed and indeed enforced. Melinda, I'm conscious of time. Let me stop there. I realize I haven't found time to talk about the AV piece of this, nor the EV piece of this, nor the shared mobility part, nor the new personal mobility devices part, but I somehow think we're going to manage to do so in our panel discussion. If I could just conclude in one phrase, this mobility conundrum in terms of the costs of the externalities is now right up the political agenda, at least in Europe. That's exciting, but we need it to catch fire. If we're going to get the political heft behind it, we have to tackle it effectively if we're going to deliver the benefits of sustainable mobility for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew, also for the punctuality. So right on to Mary.
Thank you, Melinda. Good afternoon to everyone. Matthew has just shared some good perspective on the safer part of the equation. I've been asked to say a few words about, let's call it the equitable part of this, and in particular, that which pertains to a more accessible transport system for all travelers. As we've heard today, on multiple occasions, and most recently just now, there's huge opportunity at this time to seize the burgeoning presence of new mobility to bring about a safer, more equitable transport system. New forms of on-demand services such as app-based ride services, transport network companies, shared taxis, as well as the range of bundled services that are included in mobility as a service, that broad term that we are now compelled by. These offer really interesting opportunities to enhance the ability of all travelers to access jobs, public services, healthcare, leisure activities, including those travelers in the system that carry some form of either permanent or temporary impairment to their mobility, a physical disability such as low vision or blindness, reduced hearing or deafness, or some form of cognitive disability or mental illness, which are actually much more common than we really have a tendency to acknowledge. And when combined, these services, when we combine them with the continued and renewed efforts to improve the accessibility of existing transport infrastructure, equipment, and transport services, and combine again the safety benefits that forthcoming automation, in particular driverless vehicles, can provide, these new mobility services become a compelling set of mobility options. But these on-demand, personalized services and the technologies on which they are based will only provide these benefits if they are easy to access, if they're easy to use for all travelers in the system. And what we need to avoid is that these new forms of service provision and their associated technologies, that they are developed with little or no consideration of what is in reality well more than 10 to 20% of the traveling public at any given time. And that 10 to 20% is often what is cited as a reference for the share of the traveling public at any given time that has a disability. So in fact, it's actually much more than that. One of the more persistent mistakes that we as transport professionals, so analysts, authorities, operators at all levels of government and the private sector, one of the more persistent mistakes that we make is in looking at accessibility as exclusively an issue for disabled travelers. We do this all the time. Our analysis is based on this. Business cases are built on this. And this means that the business case, the economic argument for improving accessibility, has been very difficult to make up until now. Even when the moral imperative, or the ethical imperative, the right thing to do, as it is defined in the 2006 UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that has been signed and ratified and promulgated into law in many, if not the vast majority of countries worldwide, notably the ratification. So when you add to that segment of the population that has some form of physical, sensory, or cognitive disability, when you add to that body of individuals the growing number of older people that are traveling in the system in many countries, and when you add to that population those like you and myself that travel about the system, that need to travel about the system with suitcases and children in tow, et cetera, or that have a temporary form of mobility impairment, like we sprain our ankle or we break our leg, et cetera, we're automatically talking about a more significant portion of the traveling public. And in this way, the economic case for accessibility improvements becomes much clearer. And this is essential. We've got, at some point, to fully integrate that into long-term upstream decision-making for the transport sector. We've known about it for a long time. None of what I've just said is new. But it's been a very, very long process to integrate it into to policymaking in the long term. So we know we're in an aging society right now globally, overall. By 2050, the percentage of the population 65 or older will go from around 8.5% now, since about 2015, to nearly 17% in 2050. And the oldest of the old population, those that are 80 or older, and notably in Asian and Latin American countries, is predicted to quadruple by 2050. This is significant and presents market opportunities that we simply are not taking into consideration. We know that there's a direct corollary between age and disability. Some 46% of those aged 60 or older have some form of disability. And 25% of the entire population is either directly or indirectly affected by a disability. Why is that not compelling to us? So we in the transport sector have to move from just a general nod to this reality to a full-out commitment to making accessibility an integral part of our long-term upstream decision-making. The ITF has looked, we've started to look, at the wider economic aspects of accessibility, and we proposed a framework to value the social and economic benefits of improved access, including time savings, greater convenience, more employment opportunities, and savings across the social care and health sectors. Why? Because in providing accessible mobility, we increase the length of autonomy of older and disabled travelers in the system, and therefore social care and health costs go down. So if new mobility services can help ensure better access for all travelers to buses, trains, and metros, so the traditional forms of transport, and provide timely, efficient, quality, specialized services for older and disabled travelers, then deploying these services can only be seen as positive. And progress is being made. I don't mean to imply that there isn't progress, because there is. First, TMCs, transport network companies, can offer a relatively low-cost service with fast response times that can provide, notably through partnerships with local authorities, as is the case in a number of pilots in the United States, a cost-effective way to provide paratransit-like services alongside those that are provided by public service providers. ITF work on shared mobility has shown that under certain circumstances, shared taxis can provide quality transport services for travelers that both carry disabilities and for those that are able-bodied. Part of the challenge here is making sure that there's an adequate number of wheelchair-accessible vehicles in the fleet, and there are several options, there are several ways of looking at this. But it's not just about the vehicle, it's also about training drivers, sensitizing drivers on how to safely interact with older and disabled people. Much of this training is currently embodied in taxi regulation in many countries. But as regulation is necessarily shifting with the arrival of app-based services, there is a risk that the training imperatives, this sensitization of drivers in particular, could be lost, and the service provided to older and disabled people reduced. So TNCs and app-based ride service providers need to ensure that legislative requirements, where they exist, are met by drivers, and where there is a less of a legal framework, that robust incentives are in place to ensure this quality of service. And this is starting to happen more and more. Uber and Lyft both have wheelchair accessible options. These are starting out. They're being developed, they're burgeoning, but nevertheless, there is evidence of some awareness that is starting to come forth. So to close, there are positive steps being made by on-demand mobility providers to acknowledge the need to address accessibility, but the commitment to this for both rights-based and economic reasons needs to continue to grow. I, like Matthew, have not directly addressed automation, but what I would just say with regard to safety for all travelers in the system related to automated vehicles is that the ITF, we feel that as long as a safe system approach is taken to automated vehicles, which includes vehicle and infrastructure safety plus traffic management, this does look like a compatible environment for all travelers, and including those that are older and disabled. So with that, I would thank you all very much for your attention and welcome any comments later. Thanks.
Thank you very much to both of you, Mary and Matthew, for those very helpful inputs. And also, Mary, many thanks for emphasizing the importance of skills, because that is going to be a theme also tomorrow in our final plenary. So, dear panelists, I'm looking at the clock. I know that the lure of that evening reception, meaning drinks, is going to become quite overpowering for some in the room after, let's say, 6:10. So with that in mind, I will really ask you for brief answers, if you would be so kind. I have a couple of different layers that I'd like to get us through during the panel, and it would just be great if we really can get a good dialogue exchange going. So I want to start out with a round of questions to all of you that picks up on real practical examples and use cases of the application of new mobility in promoting either safety and or access, as you will. And I have some specific questions, but please also feel free to address other aspects if you like. And I'll start out with you, Minister Dietrich, and talk about urban mobility, which of course is crucial in Latin America, elsewhere as well, but in Latin America with its very high levels of urbanization and individualized motorized traffic. So in large part, thanks to your efforts, Buenos Aires and Argentina as a whole have won awards for transport achievement in the area of sustainability, and including for that Metrobus strategy that I mentioned earlier in introducing you. Can you say a few words about how that contributes to safety and or access, and also how new mobility plays a role, if at all?
Thanks, Melinda, and thanks for the invitation. I would like to add some things about what Mary was saying. Metrobus is a BRT system, and beyond all the benefits for access that you said, I will include something that in countries like ours is crucial, is that transport infrastructure incorporate for the city urban quality space. We're talking about places that they are not the imagine that we have of Buenos Aires city, but are places 30, 40 kilometers from Buenos Aires city in the outskirts, where you don't have sidewalks, you don't have lighting, you don't have traffic lights in a lot of places. So this vision that you were sharing with us about accessibility beyond disabled people also include the access to work, because if you must travel 4 hours for your round trip, going and coming back for work every day, and you reduce 1 hour and a half, you are giving access to work. If you paved the streets where the buses are running, you give access, because when it's raining, the bus can complete their route. And this vision also of the dignity of having infrastructure of quality. We're talking about places where you have bus stations without bus stops, where perhaps are 40 lines, and the passenger doesn't know where his bus stops, and every day stops in different places, and different places are 505 blocks or 500 meters one to the other, and this is at 4 a.m. and he arrives, and the bus, when he stops, is 500 meters over there, and he cannot take the bus, and he must wait 30 minutes for the other bus, and he cannot arrive to his work. So I think that this vision of access that is not the challenges that we have in the central countries, but yes, in countries like us, where we are going to reduce this gap that we have.
Thank you very much. That links up interestingly with the presentation we heard during the Lee Schipper Awards about reliability. Reliability, such a crucial aspect of access. Many thanks for that. Let me move on to José Mendes and hear about Portugal's experience. And you also have a highly motorized transport system in Lisbon, many citizens relying on personal vehicles both for access and also for safety reasons. Yet studies by the ITF have shown that new mobility solutions like shared autonomous taxis in Lisbon could improve both access and safety while potentially reducing congestion and freeing up urban space. So is that politically feasible? Is it affordable? And in that case, what's stopping you?
Thank you, Melinda. Good that you reminded us the conclusions, the findings of the so-called Lisbon study. In fact, since 2016, we understood that due to economic activity, that both the demand and the externalities of mobility would increase a lot in Portugal. So we decided that we should have a new generation of mobility policies, and we decided to take a science-based approach. We looked at the findings of this Lisbon study, and in fact, if we replace the privately owned car fleet in the city of Lisbon by shared taxis and shared taxi buses, we would need, in the end of the day, just about 3% of the number of vehicles in the city. 95% of the space currently occupied for the transportation purposes would be free for other uses. 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions would be avoided. So this is, of course, a simulation, but we understood that we could take some of these clues to develop our policies. And we decided to start from 3 principles. The first one is that we should focus on access and equity. Mobility is not an end in itself. Mobility is an instrument. So it's important to give access to people so that they can reach opportunities. Then we would leverage on what are the new trends. Of course, digitalization and connectivity. Of course, the electrification. Of course, the sharing economy and so on, to create a rich and continuous set of options for mobility. And then we would need transitional policies. We cannot change it from one day to the other. So standing on this, we decided to develop 3 main programs. One was a massive investment in the reduction of transportation tariffs. So now, this year in Lisbon, we are investing around 150 billion euros to reduce the tariffs in public transportation. This means that families will have a cap in the amount of money they have to spend for transportation during the year. So regardless of the dimension of the family, there will be this cap that will be in Lisbon of 60 euros, not more than that. Like that, we believe that we can really promote this modal shift that we need. With this program, this year, we will have in Lisbon, in Portugal, in fact, 73,000 vehicles less on the street. This could as well reduce more than 70,000 tons of CO2 emissions. So this is the impact of this massive program. On top of it, we are investing around 200 million in a new bus fleet for the city, and in addition to that, 500 million euro to expand the metro lines in both Lisbon and Porto. So altogether, we believe that the impact of this policies will be quite positive, and we will, of course, as I said, reduce the number of trips done by car. The second program is the one of changing the regulatory framework for shared mobility. This is very important.
Can
So
I ask you to come back to that later? I want to take it. I have that in my list,
Okay.
but I think I'm going to stop you there so that
Yeah,
we can really get a first round from everybody, and then I promise you we'll come back to it a little bit later on. I want to move on now to Michael Replogle and New York City, and perhaps ask you to talk first of all about safer streets. I know that Matthew mentioned speed. I know you have reduced speed citywide, so maybe you can talk a bit about your experience there, also the role of new mobility in doing that, and also you're pioneering safe street design. So if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about New York's experience in both of those areas and how new mobility is helping and where the challenges lie.
Well, I think New York City, under the leadership of Mayor de Blasio, who came in 5 years ago, running on a platform of Vision Zero, the idea that we could reduce to zero the number of road traffic deaths and serious injuries. We have taken that on board as the central framing principle of our Department of Transportation, and a number of other city agencies have embraced this as well and meet every 2 weeks as a Vision Zero task force to coordinate across agencies, across different governmental bodies to take on these different strategies that are needed to make great progress. We've cut the number of road traffic deaths by 28% in 4 years, while they've gone up 14% in the rest of the United States. We did that through lowering speed limits, through enforcement, through more police enforcement of traffic safety related violations, through more use of speed cameras, red light cameras, and automated sensors. We've done a comprehensive safety education, but perhaps most importantly, we've also redesigned our streets and our intersections across much of the city to make it safer to walk and to bike, and to help reinforce that reduction in traffic speeds, which make the whole city more livable and safe. That indeed has also helped support us and to enable a 150% growth in bicycle use, which has also been facilitated by dramatic growth of a new bike share system. We now have 12,000 bikes in that system at 750 stations. With Lyft's investment that was just announced recently, that will expand to 40,000 bikes in the next 5 years. We're also piloting dockless bike share in a number of other parts of the outer boroughs, and hope to expand that dockless bike share system to expand travel choices for everyone. We've seen that there is safety in numbers, and that the more cyclists there are on the street, the more we're actually able to bring down cycling deaths. The growth of for-hire vehicles in the city has accompanied all of these changes and has certainly not been incompatible with our progress on traffic safety. But we have seen rising traffic congestion in our core as we have more vehicles circulating in the core of Manhattan at ever lower speeds. And so we've just adopted some new comprehensive legislation to ensure that the bases that dispatch trips to the for-hire vehicle sector have to take into account the utilization of the vehicles and drive up the average occupancy and productivity of the vehicles, which then can be used to guarantee driver income to a minimum wage after expenses. This is the first time this has been done anywhere in the world, and I think will also help us advance our sustainable mobility goals.
Thank you very much. Sergio Avelida, modal shift from non-motorized toward non-motorized travel has been very slow to pick up in a lot of African and South Asian cities, not least because even if there's a public transport system in place, it can be risky to walk or bike to wherever you can get on the metro or the bus system. So question to you would be how new mobility can play a role there, if at all, in changing that equation so that we really can encourage those last or first mile solutions.
Thank you, Melinda. This new mobility, the shared solutions that are rising in our cities around the world, can, in my opinion, offer more safety and accessibility. Can, not necessarily. we need to act to make it a good solution. First of all, we need to use Vision Zero as an approach to regulate these solutions. One of the pillars of this the Vision Zero is all of the stakeholders are responsible for safety. The public sector has to redesign streets, to act. And it's not about new mobility. It's about the reality that Matthew described for us. People are dying. Year by year, we are here in Washington, and you are describing trucks, cars, and buses as a serial killers. And you can't stop it. You need to stop it. And it's not about lack of money. Everyone in this room are prepared to discuss with financial commissioners about each money that they put in safety road will save money, a lot of money in health services. But you can't do it because you need to engage people to redesign our cities with our car-centric mindset. It's hard to do. Second of all, the private sector. You are responsible for safety road. It's not enough to put advertisement in the bikes, wear helmet. Because in a collision between a truck and a bike, helmet doesn't matter. You can do much more. And you have a very good example that we've collected from São Paulo. Just right now, one company that is exploring the bike share system are supporting the public government to test a new cycle lane. They are paying for test a new cycle lane closer than an important public transportation hub. You need to do more. You are responsible for safety road. I think the regulation framework and the Vision Zero together can protect people.
Thank you very much. Anna Wellenstein, public space has been mentioned a number of times. It's also been said in some of the other plenaries. It's so imperative that urban planners work together with transport planners. So maybe you can say a few words about city design, space design, and how that can impact on access and safety. It has been mentioned, among other things, by Minister Dietrich, but perhaps a few more words from you in view of the fact that that is very much your specialization.
No, absolutely, thank you. And I think it's great to think about when we talk about mobility, we talk about access, it's not just getting people places, but where they're trying to get to. And public spaces is a big part of where they're trying to get to and where they're trying to live. And that means not only thinking about the car route or the sidewalk route, but how the people experience those spaces. And that's a critical function. We're doing a lot today to think about the interaction between transport and urban development and land use, how people use those spaces. It overlaps with the discussion on disability and how people with disabilities access those spaces. It overlaps with discussions of aging, and it overlaps with discussions that are important in terms of gender and how women access and feel safe in those spaces. And what we find, and I think Mary made an excellent point, when you design for the disabled, you also design for many parts of the society. You design for the elderly, you design for women, and actually for me, being a woman anyway, but for you, it's more comfortable too. And that's what you find when you really look at these very accessible public spaces, very accessible transport routes. They're really pretty good for all of us. And so I think that's quite interesting. Even though you decided the tail, the middle of the curve is really pretty happy there as well. So a big part of what we look at when we're trying to integrate planning of transport and urban space and land use is to get a good feel where people are trying to go. So a big part of it is not only public spaces, but jobs. So we're doing a lot of work now in the World Bank to be able to map job accessibility. So where do people live and where are the jobs? Often in many of the developing countries we work with, they're not super close together. Part of that answer is how do we get them to that place quickly? But another important part is how do we make sure that where they live is close to the job and the job comes closer to where they live. So we're doing a lot more sophisticated mapping. Today we just finished in 11 cities, major cities in Africa, to understand really that part of the discussion, not only how fast people move, but where do they need to go. In terms of accessibility, a few more points that I think are really important. So It's not only in terms of the design of the mobility, it's in how it integrates across the space. So that you can actually get to the space through the BRT, that it's wheelchair accessible, but that the information about how to use the BRT is accessible to people that may be in a wheelchair or that may have sight problems. That the sidewalk leading up to the BRT is also accessible, so that you have complete integration end to end. You also need places that are lit well, no? I think the comment of for example, of the minister from Argentina, that transport is there on time and it's predictable. Those are crucial factors for women to access. So it's not only that you have the system, but they know when it's coming and they can depend that it will get there on time. That changes a lot the safety factor with which women experience services. ICT solutions offer a lot to make these public spaces available, but are we not only thinking about the transport route, but that the ICT solution is also very accessible to people that may have different abilities. So it's really an end-to-end integration you're looking at that makes all the difference in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to Matthew Baldwin now, and I know that you wanted to still address new mobility applications, but maybe you can do so also in talking about how we allocate road and sidewalk space. It was raised in some of the other panels that we discussed, but given your mention of vulnerable road users, and I have to say I have a very personal interest in this issue as a cyclist in Berlin, where deaths of cyclists are on the rise, and very, very troubling numbers on that. So what exactly can be done? Where does new mobility play a role? But also, what can you on the Commission do to change that?
Well, really good question, Melinda, and thanks again for asking it. Well, first of all, when it comes to deciding who does what, the European Commission is a past master at deciding the Commission doesn't need to be responsible for everything. I think one of the most interesting things about this new job I've taken on is that it's not about us pretending to have all the solutions and, you know, lay everything out in legislative terms. The most exciting thing I've been doing, I think, since I started this, is working with cities. And if you just listen, for example, to what Michael's achieved in New York City, it is so exciting. And guess what? The European Commission had nothing to do with the 28% reduction in New York City. But the principles that we're trying to apply through the SAFE system, through Vision Zero, are absolutely apposite. It's about trying to ensure we share all the good best practices in terms of infrastructure. And I'm sure that there are people in cities from all across the world around this room who've listened carefully to what Michael's done. And you know, if you can ride a bike in New York City, you can ride a bike anywhere. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do it in Sao Paulo or anywhere else. I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement. And it convinces me that cities really are the radical home of, you know, of true progressive transport policies. And if you look, you know, at so many different things, at political developments we've seen over the last few years, the split is increasingly between cities being prepared to bite the bullet and do new things, and frankly, some of the rest of us lagging behind. So I guess our role in the Commission is trying to be a support network for a lot of different research projects, a lot of different ideas, which are spilling out through Civitas, spilling out through the Polis framework, working with the great folks at ITF to make sure we have a good bully pulpit for the best possible practices for implementing the SAFE system across Europe, across the world, and particularly in cities. I think that's the best thing we can do. And when I look at one policy alone, that is the spread of these 30-kilometer-hour speed zones. I don't know what the speed limit is in New York, Michael. 25. Well, that's great progress compared to what it has been. It's like a wonderful infection that's spreading across Europe. 30 is too much, maybe. In Madrid the other day, the Spanish minister announced that 30 would be the default. 30 kilometers would be the default for Spanish cities, and 20 where necessary, not just around schools, but making that the default. And it's going to transform our cities. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to talk a bit with all of you, hopefully, about mass transit. And I'll start out with Mary and ask you, and here we can come back to new mobility applications perhaps, Mary, Which ones you see as having the greatest potential to enhance access but also safety? So new mobility applications in public transit and how they can perhaps help to boost these two pillars.
Safety and, yeah. I was actually quite heartened this week during the series of meetings at TRB, and then again this morning from the addresses that were given by Dan Sperling, that we are not talking in isolation about these new mobility services anymore. I mean, I think we started out doing that, and it was fascinating and compelling to talk about automation in isolation, to talk about transport network companies and the benefits that they can offer to a more fluid and on-demand environment for transport. But the fact of the matter is that inclusion across the globe can, in many, many urban areas, and the enormous metropolitan megacities, notably in Latin America but elsewhere, can only be achieved through collective transport services, mass transit, as expressed through the excellent BRT systems that are around the world. But as you pointed out very rightly, the BRT systems can't exist in isolation either. They have to be accessible. You have to actually be able to get to them. So I've actually been very, very heartened that we're not talking about sort of ignoring them all of a sudden, that all of this effort of the last 30 years to talk about modal shift, if you will, and moving and managing private car demand through all kinds of very uncomfortable mechanisms, but nevertheless those that we need to still keep in our mind, that isn't simply written off because we are so fascinated now with this on-demand environment. So I think the key, and again, I was so reassured to hear that several times this week, the key is really how can they be complementary? How can they lead to a complementary set of options for mobility that go right across the modes, but that include also the infrastructure, the collective transport infrastructure that's already in place, and provide an enhancing mechanism for those services.
Thank you. Michael Replogle, you gave us such an amazing exposition in your first answer about all the positives. I wonder if I can just ask you to talk a little bit about an area that at least seems to include some challenges. New York has seen ridership declines on subway, bus, and commuter rail, if I understand correctly, and also quite a significant budget gap. What accounts for that? I don't suppose all those people are now on bikes. And are the problems, would you say, operational? Are they institutional? Are they financial? And are there areas here where new mobility solutions, whatever they may be, can help to support what is surely one of the most important public transport systems in the world?
I think these are really important questions. I think the challenges of our Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York, I think first and foremost are financial, that the several successive governors have kicked the can down the road in terms of full funding for the capital program. We have growing operating deficits in the system that are now approaching $500 million a year and projected to grow close to $1 billion a year going to the middle of the next decade. We have, as a region, New York City has been growing at a fairly healthy pace over the last 15, 20 years since the sort of trough that we were in back when we were broke in the 70s and the state took over the MTA. But now we have governance structures in the MTA that really aren't keeping up with where we are. The city has essentially no say over the MTA's management. Leadership has 4 votes on the board, but the board is increasingly disregarded in the decision-making by the governor about major decisions like how to deal with the L-train crisis that is in the news this week. I think we have a real challenge in terms of needing to have new revenue sources to fully fund the Fast Forward plan for modernization of the subway. We clearly have a capital plant that's wearing out. We have a signal system that's obsolete, that needs modernization. Up until about 2013, 2014, we had growing ridership on particularly the subways. Bus ridership peaked around 2012 and started to drop with declining bus speeds. Subway ridership continued to climb, but peaked in 2015 and has been declining. And now we're seeing, with the rise of the app-based for-hire vehicle industry, an almost one-to-one transfer of ridership from the bus and subway system off to app-based providers. Clearly, the app-based providers are providing high utility services at a somewhat higher price point, but with a significant subsidy in many cases due to their venture cap. And people are realizing that the subway system is not delivering on its performance. The on-time performance had been dropping sharply, seems to have bottomed out, and is under a slight improvement under the very good leadership that came in a year ago, Andy Byford at the City Transit Authority. I think it's an open question whether the system can, and the leadership of the state and the city can all collaborate together to pull this system out of the hole that it's headed into. And I think that in many ways, if we don't, then it's a potential existential crisis for the system and for the city's economy. So there's a lot at stake in finding leadership to make this work, and I'm guardedly optimistic that, in fact, our legislature and our governor will now pull together and will work together to solve these problems.
As you speak, it makes me wonder, and I don't want to stay too long on this because we don't have a lot of time, but the Vice Minister of Addis talked to me after our panel and said, basically, if you want a public transport system that is truly giving access to the poor, it is not going to generate the revenues that you need or that your model may have assumed would be there. So do we have the wrong expectations and funding models for PT, given all of the public positive externalities it does generate for cities?
I think we do. Yeah, the public transportation is an absolute foundation for cities like New York. And if we don't finance them, then all of the generative, positive things that happen in an economy like New York City cannot happen. There's no way to replace them with for-hire vehicles, small vehicles. The city would break down in a moment. So we need to sustain capital investment. We need to find new dedicated revenue sources, and we need to move from the process by which we find a new revenue source, immediately bond it out, and then 5 years later or 3 years later or 7 years later have to start all over again because we've already spent all that dedicated revenue stream. We need longer-term leadership that recognizes that this is something we're all in together. Thank
you very much. Minister Dietrich, Argentina has one of the most comprehensive electronic ticketing systems in the world. I don't know if you say SUBE or SUBE, but say it again? SUE. Okay, wow. And I understand you are now reorienting that to try to focus more on multimodal integration and also on inclusiveness. So maybe you can say a little bit about what your aims are, how you're doing that, and how, if at all, new mobility applications are playing a role.
Yes, it's a system that it has 5.5 billion transactions per year. Is 50% more of all the credit and debit card transactions in Argentina. And with this system, what we are doing are, first of all, we are directing the subsidies for the most vulnerable people. So nowadays, they have a special discount in the fare, 55%. And also, we developed, as you asked, a system where we have an integrated tariff with discounts when you add trips, connections in your trip. The second trip, 50%, in the third, 75%, in the fourth, 75%, and the fifth, the same. This is because in areas like ours, in the metropolitan area, the people that live, that they travel more, they are more vulnerable because they live far away from the city. And also the people that travel more, they spend more money in transportation from their income. We are incorporating a fleet administration system that will give us online information. We have 18,000 buses in the system that there are 500 routes, 380 companies, and this will give us the possibility, and we are going to have implemented this in April of this year, to have a predictable system where with information when the bus is coming, and this is very important for the accessibility of the bus, for security for the women, etc., etc. And shortly, only to add, yes, I mean two, about what Sergio said, the case of Buenos Aires City with cycling. In 10 years ago, in Buenos Aires, almost no, we used to have 0.5% of the trips by bike, less than 20,000 trips per day, with every year between 8 and 10 deaths of cyclists. We developed 250 infrastructure on street protected cycle lanes in these 10 years, and now 4% of the trips are by bike, almost 300,000 trips per day. And we reduced the death to between 1 and 4 deaths per year. So the reduction was amazing, and this was because infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Matthew, you wanted to add?
I just wanted to thank the Minister for mentioning in 3 letters the word bus, because we don't have any representatives from Africa or on the platform, but I understand from people who are trying to make the most radical transformation to sustainability in African cities, it is very often about the bus in terms of accessibility and affordability. Now, if we could just get the supply of clean buses up, then we can also do clean and green at the same time. And I also, 1,000 congratulations, Minister, on the bike riding. For those of us who cycle in Brussels, where it feels like an act of reckless self-harm, change is coming. It's great. And last thing is, I take from all these great examples from cities not inside the EU as well as inside the EU, and we will use this, something I should have mentioned earlier, our sustainable urban mobility plans, and to see if we can't make this a global phenomenon, because there's so much we can learn from each other through these wonderful plans. We have more than 1,000 cities now with sustainable urban mobility plans in Europe. We're going to revamp the process. We're rewriting the guidance, bottom up, without commission, people writing it. It's a wonderful experiment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sergio Aveleda, I'd like you to put on your other hat, if you would, and speak briefly on the basis of your experience as Secretary of Transport in Sao Paulo. I'm still wanting to hear a bit more about mass transit here, and certainly you did improve mass transit there in some very dramatic ways, including ways that impacted safety and access. So maybe you can say a word about that. And I'm sorry to be a broken record, but if you can tie in new mobility applications, which, Mary pointed out, we're taking a systemic view now, and we aren't only focusing on that one piece of the picture. But nonetheless, if you care to mention them, that would be appreciated.
Okay. Thank you, Melinda. I think these new solutions, this new shared and new mobility, we need to integrate. The magic word is integration. You need to consider each model, bike, scooter, ride-hailing, taxi, buses, cabs, metro lines, in a holistic vision. It implicates, in terms of new mobility, in terms of bicycles and scooters, to integrate it with the public transportation. It will be useful for the last and first mile. Of course it will be. But you can do more than it. You can, for example, accept the same system payment of the public transportation to access e-bikes, bikes, and scooters. And you can offer a discount if people integrate these new solutions with the public transportation to incentivize these people to use different ways. But you need to consider the most efficient, green, and safe shared electrical and autonomous vehicle remains a metro train. You need to protect this massive transit. We know in the South Global, in New York as well, these systems are underfinanced. We need to protect against cannibalization from ride-hailing companies, for example. In cities that we offer a high-level service, public service, with high level of reliability, as described by our colleague from Santiago de Chile, we are not concerned about ride-hailing, because people will continue to use the public transportation, and ride-hailing companies will capture people who are inside a private cars. But it's hard to find a city in the South Global where we have a very high-level service of public transportation. So we need to regulate this sector as well to put it in integration with the public service. For example, Rio de Janeiro tried to offer a discount to integrate Uber and the metro lines.
Can I just ask you, because I know that Sao Paulo has pioneered some quite cutting-edge regulation on TNCs, on Uber, Lyft, and so on. So if you can just say a word, because thinking all the way back to this morning, and Dan Sperling telling us he doesn't really want to talk about shared, he wants to talk about pooling and about the need to nudge us in the direction of pooling. What, if anything, is Sao Paulo doing to make that happen?
São Paulo created the regulation for ride-hailing companies and they create the price that these companies have to pay to use the avenues. They pay 10 cents of reais, the Brazilian currency, to use it for each kilometer. It was the start of the regulation. After 2 years, we created a progressive fare. If they ride a lot of kilometers, more than 36 kilometers per hour, each company, they start to pay a progressive fare. And at the same time, we created some discounts for these companies. For example, if the trip is made by a woman driver, we offer a discount to incentivize these companies to authorize women to drive, because it's safe and we create opportunities. Second, if the trip is started outside of downtown, they have other discounts to address these companies to offer services in the peripheral zones. Third, if the trip is started after 10 p.m., around 10 p.m., they have another discount. And the trip is made by an electrical or hybrid car, they have another discount. The idea is to create a rule to incentivize these companies in this direction that attend the public interest.
Thank you very much. I see some flashing of signs indicating that one or two of our panelists may soon be leaving the stage, but I'm just going to try to keep us going for 5 more minutes, if I can. Anna Wellenstein, we heard a strong plea there for better integration of some of these new mobility services, whether it's ride-hailing or others, with public transport systems. But there is concern in some places that urban transport, which is already underfinanced, as we discussed, that problem could grow worse in view of these technologies. Do you see a risk there? And if so, what do we do about it?
We'll share. So I think it's important to put it in a broader context, and it can be a risk, but not necessarily. And I think it depends on the vision that city leaders take. So when city leadership takes a step back and they look at the broader goals for their cities, the broader objectives of welfare for their citizens, and an integrated view of the investments and the services that get them there, and pull finances from that angle, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to go downhill. So if you think of things like rideshare can be great, but if we don't have investments in sidewalks and public spaces pretty soon the ride share starts to be affected. No, people aren't as interested. Similarly, if they save money on low-income housing and it's further out in the city where there's cheap land, but they no longer have a good public transport system, and ride share will be more expensive for the poor, that public housing becomes ineffective and the price of it goes up. So when city leaders take a look back, and they look at what their objectives really are for citizens, and they look across the board at their finances, where the income's going to come from, where economies will grow, and what people need, I think you get more of a balance. It's not easy, it's complicated, and it can involve transformation in the kinds of services we need, but I think it is possible.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time, so I'm just going to ask Minister Dietrich, who I think is the person who's going to be leaving very soon, if I don't mistake those signals, briefly talk to us about harassment. I know that your ministry has taken measures to try to tackle the problem of harassment on public transportation. It's a problem throughout the world. So if you can just tell us very briefly, because it is so crucial, both in terms of safety, but also access for women who want to ride public transport. What are you doing?
Yes, first, sorry, but I'm losing a train, so I must leave. What we were doing during the last year is to launch a campaign for lighting this very big problem that we have in our cities, that we have in public transport. In Buenos Aires metropolitan area, 58% of the passengers are women. And something like 80% of them, they suffered harassment in public transport. So the campaign is to educate the bus drivers, so to be aware about this, to have conscience, most of them are men, to know what to do in these situations and not to decide by their own what is better. We launched a CMS line that it is a harassment in Spanish, acoso, where the women can write if they have a problem, and also they receive information. They can denounce is okay? Denounce this, and also for the passengers in general, for the men. Telling them that these machines, no, how do you say? Yes. That some, what is the impact of this? Because sometimes it's cultural to say something that perhaps he thinks that is funny and is received very aggressive by the woman. We are working in the trains also. So I think that it's important to lighten this and to work. This is a long-term process to change dramatically these figures, but well, it's one of the lines where we work in. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to be here, to see a lot of people, very important working in urban sustainability, and for me, a honor to participate here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being with us. We're going to let you go. But I want to pose one last question to José Mendez, who has been very patient throughout this discussion. I'm going to move us away from mass transit, but if you want to say something about that, by all means, do so. But I'd like to have at least one brief interchange on the question of what kind of institutional changes and essentially cooperative frameworks can help policymakers to triangulate these goals, safety and access, but also the other goals we're going to be talking about tomorrow morning, economy and economic efficiency and environment. These are four very big goals that we're talking about. Trying to balance them clearly is a challenge. So maybe you have some thought on the institutional structures and mechanisms and processes that can help policymakers do that.
Yeah, thanks, Melinda. What we did in Portugal was to decentralize the competencies of transport authorities. You know, previously, I would say 5 years ago, those responsibilities were concentrated in the National Public Institute. And this was not fine, of course, that's quite obvious. Now, what we did is that we decentralized, so the options regarding the design of the mobility models and the transportation lines, the options regarding the tariff schemes belong to the local authorities. I give you an example. In the city of Porto, for instance, which is a second city in Portugal, of course, like in many cities, they have different fare models for riders, but they developed a model in which, according to the number of trips that you use during the months, it adjusts and optimizes the fare model so that is in favor of the rider. And the consequence of this is that people that think or believe that during the months they will have, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 trips, instead of doing it by private car, they start to use the public transport because they know that their fare model will be optimized. Additionally, I mean, the massive tariff reduction program I told you about before is being implemented with the collaboration of the transport operators, because they understood that due to the elasticity that still exists in the mobility arena in Portugal, that they can increase the demand. Meaning that, I mean, reducing about 30% of the tariff of the transportation costs would result in an increase of 10% in the demand in Portugal. This is quite studied. So involving public transport operators, both public and private, involving local authorities, and of course the national bodies, we are, I believe, optimizing things in a better way. I mean, for instance, sometimes a mayor comes to me asking for financial support to build bike lanes, for instance. What I tell them is, listen, I mean, you have this power to reduce speed, because the problem, and coming to this safety topic, the problem is that we are deploying solutions that are based on the digital possibilities, but we are deploying it on an infrastructure that was designed for cars. So the first thing is to reduce the speed gap between these different forms of mobility. So I mean, listen, reduce the speed and you will expand the opportunities for bikes to ride. So it's the cheapest way of expanding the bike lane extension. So I mean, in this dialogue, we found, I believe now, a balanced institutional framework to foster a better mobility in Portugal.
That was a question I wanted to put to you too, Mary. You just raised your finger, and that's good, because I wanted to come to you basically for one last word on how you see that, based on the ITF's international perspective on this. Where do you see processes, institutional structures that you would say are doing a really good job of triangulating these different goals, synergies, but also perhaps trade-offs?
Just very briefly, and following on to José Mendez's comments there, while it's absolutely essential that responsibility for certain of the types of initiatives that you've described be devolved to the appropriate levels at devolved levels of authority, regions, local authorities, cities, et cetera. Once we start talking about this need for triangulation, as you put it, Melinda, or a framework that is going to provide sound governance for a multiplicity of very complex goals, such as what we're talking about here in the context of Some for All and others. You need the national government there. And what we have seen, unfortunately, in, let's just take the example of disability, for example. There are a number of countries that have taken very bold steps to develop and provide comprehensive legislation related to accessibility and disability more generally, right across sectors. But once the legislation has been promulgated and is in place, the national authorities, in a number of cases, have retreated and said, our job is done. And it is now up to the devolved levels of authority to do it, to actually implement it. The problem being that whilst the responsibilities have been devolved to these lower levels of government and of authority, the commensurate fiscal resource or fundraising capabilities are not there. So you've got a disconnect between the ability financially to actually put in place the responses and the responsibility itself. And this is seen over and over and over again. So implementation is a huge problem, and this has been one of the big institutional factors as to why we haven't seen more progress, even when there is comprehensive, robust legislation in place. So the national government must not retreat, but it definitely needs its appropriate role. But to provide that framework for this multiplicity of goals and incentive structures that don't clash, but that are actually well coordinated at a national level. And this is something that national authorities need to be mindful of and continue to do so.
Thank you very much. We could go on at length, but I'm very appreciative of the fact that the wine bottles have probably been open for 12 minutes now. So I will just ask us to all give a very warm round of applause to this panel.